There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a press room when something unexpected happens. Not the polite, attentive quiet of journalists dutifully transcribing answers, but a sudden, electric stillness, the kind where people instinctively stop clicking their pens and look up from their laptops. The kind that means something just happened. That silence fell over Melbourne Park's press conference room on the evening of Thursday, January 23, 2026, when Novak Djokovic, 38 years old, 10-time Australian Open champion, holder of 24 Grand Slam titles, the most decorated men's tennis player in the history of the sport, paused mid-thought, shifted in his chair, and said a name that nobody in that room had asked him about. Alex Eala. Not Aryna Sabalenka, the defending champion. Not Carlos Alcaraz, the heir apparent. Not any of the seeded names who fill the brackets of Grand Slam draws and populate the imaginations of tennis insiders. Djokovic brought up a 20-year-old from the Philippines who had just lost her first-round match 4 days earlier, entirely of his own accord, entirely without prompting, and what he said next sent shockwaves through a sport that does not typically move quickly. She is the greatest tennis player from that country, and that is a significant country. There is a lot of interest. 3 sentences. 12 seconds, maybe 15. And just like that, a girl who had arrived in Melbourne as a curious footnote, the first Filipina in Australian Open history, left it as something else entirely. Something permanent. Before Melbourne, the making of a moment. To understand what Djokovic's words meant, you have to understand what Alexandra Eala had already done before she set foot on an Australian Open court. Because by the time January 2026 arrived, the story had been building for nearly 2 years. Quietly at first, then all at once, in the way that truly significant things tend to announce themselves. Eala grew up in the Philippines, in a country of more than 100 million people that has produced world-class athletes across boxing, basketball, and billiards, but had never, in the entire history of professional tennis, sent a woman into the main draw of any Grand Slam singles tournament. Not once. The sport existed in the Philippines, certainly. Players existed. But the gap between Filipino tennis and the international elite had seemed, for a very long time, like one of those distances that can be measured in miles, but is really measured in resources, infrastructure, and opportunity. Eala began closing that gap early. She trained at the Rafa Nadal Academy in Manacor, Spain, one of the most respected development programs in the world. And she did what the best young players do. She learned, she competed, she suffered, and she got better. Her junior career was exceptional. Her transition to the professional game was harder, as it always is, because professional tennis is a different world entirely from junior success, and the gap between those two worlds has swallowed players with far more fanfare than Eala ever received. But then came 2025, and something shifted. At the Miami Open, she walked onto the court against Alina Svitolina, a Grand Slam finalist, a former world number 3, a player with a decade of elite experience, and she beat her. Cleanly. Convincingly. The kind of win that makes coaches watching on courtside tablets exchange glances. She followed that with a run through qualifying at Eastbourne that earned her a place in the main draw, and then, at the 2025 US Open, she did something that no Filipino had ever done in tennis history. She won a Grand Slam main draw match. It sounds simple when you write it out that way. It wasn't. It was the product of years of work, of early mornings in a Spanish academy far from home, of losses in qualifying draws that most tennis fans never see, of a stubbornness that she carries quietly but completely. Each result built on the last. Each win made the next one feel slightly more possible. By the time the Australian Open draw was announced for January 2026, Eala was ranked 49th in the world. Inside the top 50, seeded to avoid the top players in the early rounds, and scheduled to make her Australian Open debut as the first Filipina in the tournament's history. The press conference she gave before the tournament received 175,000 views on the Australian Open's official YouTube channel. To put that in context, the comparable clip for Aryna Sabalenka, the world number 1, received around 28,000. For Carlos Alcaraz, 8,000. She hadn't hit a ball yet. She was already the most watched player at the tournament. Court 6, the miscalculation that changed everything. Tennis tournaments are logistical operations as much as sporting ones. Scheduling, deciding which matches go on which courts, at what times, with what priority, is one of the most consequential decisions tournament organizers make each day. Get it right and things flow smoothly. Get it wrong, and you create a problem that outlasts the match itself. The Australian Open got it spectacularly wrong. When the draw was confirmed and Eala's first-round opponent was set, organizers assigned her debut to Court 6. It is a perfectly adequate facility, compact, efficient, well-suited to the kinds of first-round matches that rarely attract more than a few hundred spectators. Most players who appear on Court 6 in the first round are players that only the most dedicated tennis followers can name. The court is functional, not atmospheric. It serves its purpose. Eala's match on Court 6 was not a typical first-round match. Hours before her scheduled start time, the line outside Court 6 had grown to a length that alarmed the ground staff. It extended past the pathway, past the neighboring courts, and, according to multiple eyewitnesses, all the way back toward Rod Laver Arena, the tournament's showcase stadium. People had arrived at dawn. Families with young children. Elderly fans who had clearly traveled a considerable distance. Young women wrapped in Philippine flags and wearing Eala's name on their shirts, some of them carrying handmade signs in Tagalog that expressed, in the direct and unself-conscious way of people who love something openly, exactly how much this moment meant to them. They waited in 30-degree Melbourne heat. They sweated through their clothes. They refused to leave the queue even as it became clear that the court's capacity, somewhere around 3,000 people, was going to be reached and surpassed before the match even started. And then the gates closed. Hundreds of people, maybe more, were locked out. Problems to deal with. He could have stopped there. It was a clean answer. Diplomatic, quotable, entirely sufficient. The journalists would have moved on to the next question, and the press conference would have concluded without incident, and nobody would have written about it the following morning. He didn't stop there. "I noticed that with Alex Eala the other day," he said. "Yes, that's been quite a conversation." The room sharpened. You could feel it, that collective recalibration of attention that happens when a press conference suddenly becomes something other than routine. Reporters who had been typing stopped typing. People looked up. Djokovic continued. "Some players come from countries where tennis has a long tradition. She is coming from the Philippines, which is now very significant." He leaned into those last 4 words. Which is now very significant. Not which will be significant. Not which could be significant someday if everything goes right and the results keep improving. Now, present tense. A declaration rather than a prediction, delivered by the one man in professional tennis whose declarations about the sport carry the weight of everything he has lived and won and survived within it. "She is the greatest tennis player from that country," he went on. "And that is a significant country. There is a lot of interest." He paused again, and then, almost as an afterthought, though nothing Djokovic says in front of a microphone is truly an afterthought, he addressed the Court 6 controversy directly. "You could say the scheduling may have been inadequate, and perhaps they could have placed her on a larger court. Yes, but she's young, she's still developing. The big courts have full programs in the early rounds. It's challenging to schedule these things. But again, it's a great problem to have." And then the line that silenced every critic at once, the line that landed differently from everything else because of who was saying it and what he had seen in 25 years of professional tennis. "We want more attention. We want more people coming. We want more people watching and following tennis. I don't see any downside. No downside." From Novak Djokovic, a man who has played tennis in virtually every atmosphere imaginable. Hostile Australian crowds during his deportation saga in 2022, the reverential, almost ecclesiastical quiet of Wimbledon's centre court, the partisan intensity of Davis Cup stadiums where entire nations seem to be compressed into a single roar. A man who has been booed and cheered and loved and despised by tennis audiences across 6 continents. A man who knows, better than almost anyone alive, what crowds can do to a match, to a player, to a sport. That man looked at what happened on Court 6 and called it a gift. What those words actually meant. It is worth dwelling on this for a moment, because the significance of Djokovic's comments operates on several levels simultaneously, and it is easy to absorb the emotional impact without fully unpacking what was actually being said. On the surface, Djokovic was simply being gracious. He was acknowledging a young player's impact, defending the enthusiasm of her supporters, and offering a measured perspective on a debate that had been generating more heat than light for the better part of a week. That alone would have been noteworthy. Players of Djokovic's stature don't typically spend their press conferences discussing first-round losers, and the mere act of mentioning Eala by name, voluntarily, without prompting, in the context of a broader conversation about tennis's health and future, was a significant gesture. But there was more to it than graciousness. When Djokovic said that the Philippines is now very significant in tennis, he wasn't making a statistical observation. He was making a cultural one. He was saying that Eala's presence, not just her results, but her presence, the crowds she generates, the attention she attracts, the conversation she provokes, has changed something about how tennis should be understood in that part of the world. He was saying that significance is not solely conferred by Grand Slam titles or world rankings, that it can also be conferred by what a player means to a community of people who had never previously had reason to follow the sport. When he said she is the greatest tennis player from that country, he was not simply stating a fact, though it happens to be true. He was performing an act of recognition, formal, public, and deliberately unambiguous. He was saying, I see her. I know who she is. She has earned her place in the conversation I have. Coming from anyone else, this would have been kind. Coming from Djokovic, it was something closer to consecration. And when he said he sees no downside to the kind of enthusiasm Eala's supporters brought to Court 6, he was taking a side in a debate that most establishment tennis figures had been carefully avoiding. He was saying, plainly and without diplomatic hedging, that the traditionalists who complained about crowd behavior were wrong. Not just tactically wrong, not just strategically wrong for the sport's commercial interests, but wrong in a more fundamental sense. That a sport which claims to want new audiences cannot then turn around and penalize those audiences for not behaving like audiences who have been attending Grand Slams for 30 years. That growth has costs, and one of those costs is that the culture changes, and that is acceptable and in fact desirable. This was not a minor position to take. This was Novak Djokovic, a player who has been, at various points in his career, the most polarizing figure in tennis, a man who has fought institutional battles with governing bodies and watched his reputation suffer for it, standing up in a press conference and telling tennis to be more generous with itself, to open its doors wider, to stop hoarding its traditions at the expense of its future. In the Philippines, the reaction to his words was immediate and overwhelming. The response, a nation exhales. Social media platforms, already straining under the weight of Eala-related content from the previous 4 days, effectively buckled when Djokovic's quotes began circulating. Filipino fans who had spent days absorbing criticism of their behavior at Court 6, who had read the think pieces and the tweets and the forum posts about tennis etiquette and Grand Slam traditions and the proper way to express enthusiasm for a sport they were experiencing, in many cases, for the first time, suddenly had something they hadn't expected. Validation from the greatest champion the sport had ever produced. The clips spread everywhere simultaneously. WhatsApp groups in Manila, diaspora community pages in Melbourne and Los Angeles and London and Dubai, and honestly, at a considerable distance from the names that occupy the top of the game. And now one of those names had turned around and pointed at her, had said her name in a press conference without being asked, had described her in terms, greatest from her country, significant nation, no downside, that placed her firmly within the conversation she had modestly excluded herself from. It wasn't a trophy. It wasn't prize money. It wasn't a ranking point or a seeding or any of the quantifiable measures by which tennis officially evaluates its players. It was something rarer and, in certain ways, more durable, recognition. The kind of recognition that doesn't require a scoreboard to justify it, that can't be taken away by a bad draw or a difficult day or a third-set collapse. Djokovic had written Eala's name into the history of the sport before she had won a single Grand Slam match. Not because she had earned it statistically, but because of what she represented and what she had already done to the sport simply by showing up. There is a version of this moment that diminishes over time. There is a version where it becomes a footnote, a nice thing that Djokovic said once, in a press conference that most people have forgotten, about a player who didn't ultimately fulfill her early promise. Sport is littered with those moments. Players who generated enormous excitement before their careers leveled off or were interrupted by injury, or simply ran into the limits of what talent and training can achieve. The moment that felt like a coronation revealed itself, in retrospect, to have been premature. But there is another version, and the evidence, looked at carefully and without sentimentality, suggests this is the more likely one. Why this is just the beginning. Alex Eala arrived in Melbourne as a 20-year-old ranked 49th in the world. She is trained by one of the most sophisticated tennis development programs on the planet. Her game, technically sound, tactically intelligent, physically capable of handling the demands of a Grand Slam draw. is the game of a player who has spent years being shaped by professionals who know what elite tennis requires. She is not a novelty. She is not a feel-good story that exists primarily for the meaning it carries. She is a serious tennis player who lost a match at the Australian Open and will be back. Consider what she accomplished before that loss. She beat a top 10 player at Miami. She reached a final at Eastbourne after grinding through qualifying. She won a Grand Slam main draw match at the US Open as the first Filipino ever to do so. She arrived at the Australian Open with a pre-tournament press conference that outperformed every other players in terms of online viewership, including the world number one. None of this happened because of narrative luck or favorable draws, or the kind of soft scheduling that sometimes flatters developing players. It happened because she is good at tennis and is getting better. She is 20 years old. She has been a professional tennis player for a relatively short time. The players who will define the next decade of women's tennis are, in many cases, still being identified and developed right now, still going through the painful, incremental process of turning potential into consistency. Eala is already inside the top 50. She already has the kind of mental resilience, demonstrated clearly in how she carried herself through the Australian Open, through the loss, through the controversy, through the attention, that coaches spend years trying to build into players. She already knows what it feels like to perform in front of a crowd that is entirely, completely, overwhelmingly invested in her success. That knowledge is not nothing. It is, in fact, a significant competitive asset. And she carries something else that cannot be manufactured or developed in a training academy. She carries a nation. More than 100 million people who had no reason to follow professional tennis before she arrived, who now have a direct and personal stake in what happens every time she walks onto a court. That is a weight, certainly, she has said so herself, but it is also a fuel source of almost inexhaustible intensity. Players who compete for something beyond themselves tend to find reserves that players competing only for themselves cannot always access. The great champions of the sport have almost universally talked about this. The way that playing for your country, your community, your people transforms what it is possible to endure. Djokovic knows about this. He has spoken throughout his career about the particular force of playing for Serbia, a small country with enormous national pride, and how it sustained him through matches and seasons and controversies that might otherwise have broken him. When he looked at what was happening on court 6 and recognized it, genuinely, without condescension or calculation, he was recognizing something he understood from the inside. He was seeing a player discovering the fuel that the best careers are built on. What Djokovic actually did. In the days after his press conference, some commentators suggested that Djokovic had been overly effusive, that he had allowed himself to be swept up in a feel-good narrative at the expense of sober assessment, that celebrating a player who had just lost in the first round was a category error dressed up as generosity. This is a misreading, and it is worth addressing directly. Djokovic did not say that Eala had won the Australian Open. He did not say she was among the best players in the world right now, or that her current results placed her alongside the champions who populate the top of the rankings. He said something much more specific, that she is the greatest tennis player from her country, that her country is significant, and that the attention she generates is unambiguously good for tennis. All three of these statements are factually accurate. None of them require inflating her current achievements beyond what they are. What he added, through the act of saying these things voluntarily and publicly, was a frame. A way of understanding what Eala's presence in professional tennis means that goes beyond match results and ranking points. He gave journalists and fans a language for talking about her that isn't just about whether she wins or loses on any given day, but about what she represents in the longer arc of the sport. He gave the Filipino community a legitimization of their investment in her career that came from the most credible possible source. And he gave Eala herself something that young players rarely receive. A clear and unambiguous signal from a legend of the game that she is seen, that she is taken seriously, that her story matters to the people at the top of the sport she is working to join. This is what the greatest players sometimes do for the next generation. Not just inspire them from a distance, but reach back and pull them forward, publicly, explicitly, in ways that create a record. Billie Jean King did it for generations of women in tennis. Arthur Ashe did it for young black players who needed to see that the sport had room for them. Martina Navratilova did it. Roger Federer has done versions of it throughout his career, pointing out players he admired before the wider tennis world had caught up to his assessment. These moments matter. They matter because professional sports are, At some level, confidence games. Games in which the belief that you belong is not incidental to performance but constitutive of it. Being told you belong by someone who has earned the right to make that determination changes something in a player. It changes something in how fans see that player. It changes something in how the sport itself understands where it is going. Djokovic did not hand Eala a trophy on Thursday evening in Melbourne. He gave her something more uncommon: his attention, his platform.